Hello, good afternoon. I am thrilled to have joining me Dr. Sinead Dufour, talking all about something that is really common but actually not talked about too often, which is pelvic floor health. If you're catching the replay, thank you so much for joining. My name is Brianne Callanan. I'm a naturopathic medical intern and I'm a mom of two myself. And I know the symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction all too well. And I am just so happy to be talking about this because it's something that we need to be talking about as women, because there's things that we can do to support you if you are having symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction. And these symptoms are often displayed as normal. You know, after we have a baby, we talk to other moms and they say, well, I have that too. That's just a part of motherhood, but it's not. And there are definitely things that we can do to help you and to kind of lower or reduce those symptoms that you are experiencing. So please tell me a little bit more about yourself. What is pelvic health? What does a pelvic health physiotherapist do?
Great. Thanks so much, Brianne. So I'm Sinead Dufour. I'm a pelvic health physiotherapist, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. I work at a center with a fabulous team, a maternity care center called The Womb, the world of my baby. And I split my time between my clinical practice and academic work at McMaster University. So I teach and I conduct research. But let's launch in first to what is a pelvic health physiotherapist, if no one has heard of that. So essentially a pelvic health physiotherapist, it's a physiotherapist who has advanced specialization in urogynecology and obstetrics. And this specialty of physio was really only recognized by our College of Physiotherapists, our regulating body, in 2012. So in Ontario, it's actually quite new, which is why more and more people are hearing about pelvic health in the last few years. But actually, pelvic health is not certainly a new issue by any means. Pelvic health physiotherapy is very well established in Europe as well as in Quebec. So certainly way back when I had my twins, I had to go see a pelvic health physiotherapist in Quebec back in those days. So I certainly was brought into this field myself through my own personal experience. As I said, I have twins, and I certainly experienced some issues afterwards that I really didn't get the care I needed to correct, which eventually led me to a pelvic physio, which is essentially what I do now.
Can you tell us a little bit more of some common symptoms that we might see that would indicate that someone would need to see or could benefit from a pelvic health physiotherapist?
Yeah, of course. So you alluded to already, Brianne, that we have been told this story that there are certain things we just have to kind of deal with after we bear children, which simply is like that swan song has been sung. Like that is completely not the case. What happens during childbirth, delivery, even carrying a baby is there's an enormous amount of strain to the pelvic tissue. And unfortunately, the way our birth practices are set up, they're very sort of medicalized and unnecessarily so. And a lot of those practices really create additional trauma to the pelvic tissues. So like any tissue that's traumatized or injured, the typical approach is a rehab protocol. And that's just something that we haven't kind of consistently done where the pelvic floor tissues are concerned. So in France, for example, you have a baby, you automatically see a pelvic physio right away. There's an understanding that some soft tissue has been injured and a rehab protocol is necessary. So the signs and symptoms of this dysfunction are really no different than if you had an issue somewhere else in your body. I think the issue is really just that we've been taught to kind of ignore it. So any pain is certainly in the pelvic region is certainly something that, warrants further investigation. Anytime there is leaking of urine during any task, This certainly is a common issue that will happen if the pelvic floor has been damaged, which it often does get a little bit of damage and sometimes a great deal of damage in childbirth. But it represents a dysfunction. It represents that those tissues need restoration. It tells you that that mechanism that the pelvic floor is meant to maintain is faulty. And so that's a big one for people, to not ignore those little leaks, even if people think, oh, well, I'm just leaking if I'm laughing really heartily or when I cough and sneeze and I just kind of cross my legs and I manage it. It still is telling you that there's a dysfunction there that we can correct quite easily. Even some women end up with an issue afterwards where they're actually going pee way too frequently. They might think, yeah, I feel like something has changed in my bladder, or my bladder's a lot smaller, or they have stronger urges to pee and they're peeing more frequently. And that's another sort of dysfunctional issue that can end up in a condition called urge incontinence, where the bladder can just kind of randomly start to contract and empty on you in the most inopportune times. So that's certainly not something to leave sort of unchecked if you're peeing more frequently or you're getting those strong urges in a different way than you did before. Mm-hmm. There can often be issues with constipation or hemorrhoids that just aren't getting any better, which is kind of giving some indication that, repeated mechanisms of how you're doing things is not optimal. And then what we often consider as a pelvic floor issue is when the connective tissue of the abdominal wall gets compromised. And for some women, that can really be their main obvious symptoms. Their pelvis needs a little bit of rehab. And that can be when the tummy looks like it's a bit pooching. And maybe you feel like you've lost all your baby weight. You feel back in shape. Everything is fine, other than your tummy is not quite right. And the more you do traditional ab work, the worse it tends to get. That's another sign that you need some rehabilitation, that a pelvic health physio is probably the best person to guide you in.
Could you talk a little bit why those traditional crunches are kind of counterproductive, if maybe even dangerous, for women who already have damage or weakness to that linea alba, the ligament that really connects those abdominal tissues?
Yeah, of course. So traditional crunches, I often use the analogy of a zipped up sweatshirt. So when you have a sweatshirt that's zipped up and you sort of curl forward in a crunch motion, the physics of that motion and how the force is transmitted through that sweatshirt is a very sort of even distribution. But if you had a situation where the middle of the zipper has kind of broken and popped open, and then you curl forward, you can appreciate how the force distributes around that material now quite differently. And actually that zipper is going to get more broken and more broken and more broken, and the wider and wider and wider the more you do it. And that is probably the easiest way to understand how just the physics of the tissue is very, very different when you have a compromise now in the middle of that tissue that used to be held together quite strongly and quite evenly with good integrity. The other problem with crunches is that if a really perfect technique is used for crunches and there is no injury anywhere, then people can often get away with doing crunches without any harm, and everything is fine. What happens though, even if you don't have a very obvious problem in that abdominal wall after you have a baby, because not everyone does, oftentimes the pelvic floor though, and the coordination between the pelvic floor and the transversus abdominis, which is another deep core muscle, the coordination of those tissues isn't what it used to be, partially because there's usually a bit of injury to the pelvic floor, but partially because of the hormones from post-birth, or if you're breastfeeding, can sort of down-regulate the communication between those muscles a little bit. So the ability to execute a crunch in a way that's going to be non-damaging, the likelihood of being able to do that's pretty slim. So you're going to end up doing that crunch usually with a little bit of what we call a Valsalva technique, right, which is going to create extra pressure down on your organs, this downward pressure on your organs. And then if you don't have a great pelvic floor to hold everything up, you're actually setting yourself up for another problem called prolapse. So there are a lot of reasons why, even if crunches worked well for you before this stage of life, why they're probably not going to work well for you sort of after you get pregnant and have a baby. And you may get to the point where you eventually bring something like that back in. But given a lot of the research that's been done at the University of Waterloo by Stu McGill, crunches actually have such a horrible impact on the spine. So these are all studies that were done on men. So this isn't even considering the implications for women specifically. But because of the detrimental effects on the spine, our armed forces no longer even does sit-ups in their protocols. So I personally don't see a purpose of an exercise that's flexion-based when a big issue in our society is that we're sitting too much and we're in too much flexion. I would much prefer people retraining their core and their abdominals and their back through extended based exercise where you're in extension.
And that's such a really great point. And I find as women, and I personally was guilty of this myself, we think, we want to tone up that midsection and we want crunches, crunches, crunches. But what we don't realize is we're really making that pooch or that lower abdominal separation worse by doing so. So that's why with your help and with your expertise, I've completely revamped my weight loss on the Wild Side program to really not include any abdominal muscles, because you can get a lean midsection and a better appearance when those abdominal muscles are realigned and you're not damaging your core in the process, which is so, so important. I want to also ask you, other than childbirth, is there other risk factors for having a diastasis recti, abdominal separation, other reasons to come see a pelvic health physiotherapist?
Yeah, so I'll address the question about the diastasis piece first. So certainly this is something men can get to. And ultimately, what the real issue with that diastasis is doing these repeated Valsalva techniques. So men will often get this when they are doing 200 crunches a day with incorrect technique. They are doing heavy weightlifting again with incorrect technique. They don't have the motor control and the sequencing in their deep core system to load their body the way they're loading it. So they have to rely on a strategy to stabilize through the thorax and pelvis. That means they have to increase that intra-abdominal pressure in that area to make up for the lack of deep core strength. And when that's done repeatedly, things are going to start to bust. So that tissue is going to start to bust, and there's going to be downward irritation to the pelvic organs and the pelvic floor. So it really is the same mechanism. It's just, of course, women are much more vulnerable to this problem given what happens during childbirth, right? And actually carrying a baby for the better part of a year, right?
And what if someone has a C-section or a hysterectomy? Could they also benefit from an assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings me to that second piece you asked is, why would people come to see a pelvic physio? And yes, there's the usual issues. If there's any incontinence, if there's any obvious bowel problem, if you have kind of a known diastasis problem, or your tummy's not right, or you have a known prolapse, those are all pretty obvious things, as well as if you have pain anywhere, right? But certainly after any type of surgery within the sort of pelvic thoracic region, so this would be hysterectomies, laparoscopic surgeries for endometriosis removal, umbilical hernia repairs, cesarean sections. So we tend to see some issues with cesarean section tend to be less, like prolapse, for example. But because there is a cut right through the abdominal wall and all of that fascia, we often will see a higher frequency of diastasis because there's such tension at the bottom. And I think women are sometimes feeling a little bit more protected because they didn't have a vaginal delivery. They're not having incontinence. They're not having those symptoms. So sometimes they revert to the crunch style exercises. And again, they have the bottom of their abdomen really has no give to it at all. So a lot of that force is going to have to burst in a much more profound way to the upper part of the linea alba. And so you're a little bit more vulnerable. So those are some people who need some education. Another issue with cesarean section is painful intercourse. That is such a common problem. That's certainly an issue I had after I had a C-section when I had my twins that I was not expecting. And I was really confused as to why I was having that problem. And no one could help me with this until I saw my pelvic physio. And what happens is because the fascia is pulled so tight from that surgery, and certainly this can happen with other surgeries too, there's usually a degree of tension after surgery because things have been sewn up tighter or there's guarding, right? There's scar tissue or there's guarding. So because of all that increased tension, that tension in the pelvic floor can make everything too tight and can be really, really painful if there's any attempted penetration. But the good news is through some really basic intervention, we can completely correct that. So that is something else to be on the radar of painful intercourse is another big indication to come see pelvic physio.
And what can you expect at an appointment?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I will say that just like sort of every doctor, every ND, every fitness provider sort of has their own style and their own approach. I can certainly speak to what you can expect from most places, and certainly this is how I practice. But typically at the first visit, we do spend the majority of that time talking to you, getting a really good idea of exactly has gone on, a good idea of what's kind of gone in your history, so we already have a pretty good sense of where we might need to go. We then will do some sort of more regular physiotherapy things, right? It's not just all about internally looking in the pelvis. We want to look at everything. So we still will look at the spine, look at the pelvis, look at the hips, try to get a sense of what does the motor control of those deep core muscles kind of look like. And then beyond that, we will move on to an internal pelvic exam. Usually on the first day, this actually doesn't take too long. But the reason why we do this internal exam is to get a good sense of what the pelvic floor tissues are doing. And the pelvic floor is a layer of muscles. It's actually 3 interdigitated layers of muscle that connect from the pubic bone to the tailbone and then to each of the bones that you sit on. We call them your sit bones. So essentially, it's like a trampoline at the bottom of your pelvic cavity, holding everything up. And we kind of want to go in and get a sense of what's happening. Are there aspects that are too tight? Are there aspects that have shrunken away? Are there aspects that have a lot of scarring through them? We also can tell from this exam, what are the organs doing? Is there a bulging of any of the 3 pelvic organs, which is the rectum, the uterus, and the bladder? Is there any of those organs, is there a bit of a downward movement? What happens to the organs if you cough? You know, do they maintain in place or are they moving down? And does that give us some indication on, you know, maybe we want to sort of limit really strenuous things until we get your deep core supporting those organs a little bit better. So there's a lot of really important things we can figure out in that exam. It's usually a goal to, within the first few visits, try to make sure that that pelvic floor tissue, that series of those 3 layers of muscle, is connected well enough to the brain so the person is able to voluntarily contract and relax those muscles. So, you know, sometimes it takes a visit or two to actually help someone relax those tissues before we're even going to get into wanting them to contract those tissues. But essentially to correct any single issue that has to do with the pelvis, and I would even say back and thorax, we need to make sure that we can properly voluntarily contract the pelvic floor, fully relax it, be able to kind of sustain that contraction with endurance, be able to contract quickly. And we also want to make sure that eventually there's a bit of an automatic function restored in the pelvic floor where when you cough, sneeze, laugh, the pelvic floor actually should automatically contract to, you know, ensure that a continence mechanism is maintained with that little amount of increased abdominal pressure. And that reflex is a reflex that kind of gets disconnected for a lot of women through carrying a baby and having a baby. So that's a reflex that over time we want to kind of build back in.
And that was a really great point that for some women, the pelvic floor is actually, it has really areas of tightness or what we would call trigger points. And that's why just saying to everyone who's had a baby, you know, just go do Kegels is not the best approach. And really going to see a pelvic health physiotherapist can really pinpoint exactly what exercises are appropriate for you. They can tell whether or not you're properly engaging your pelvic floor. And that's why that internal exam is really so valuable, because you might not even realize that you're doing the exercises incorrectly.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. Certainly, I've seen this in clinical practice where, for the most part, women are not understanding how to contract their pelvic floor properly. And I had that experience myself when I saw pelvic physio. I thought I knew how to contract my pelvic floor. I had been a physiotherapist for 7 years, but I wasn't doing it right. And we have research to substantiate that over half of women, when they think they're doing a pelvic floor contraction, they're actually doing a bit of a Valsalva, which is exactly what we don't want. So that internal exam is critical.
That is so interesting. Really making the problem worse by doing extra Valsalva when you think that you're doing more of the Kegel-based movements. Can you talk a little bit about this, the urge suppression technique, or the peeing just in case, and why women should not be peeing just in case, and how that really changes the interaction between the brain and the bladder?
Yes, that is a great question. So this is something I see all the time, that, you know, when a woman's pelvic floor starts to not function as well as it used to, a very common strategy to cope with that issue is just keeping the bladder as empty as possible, because then you're less likely to leak. Well, the problem is that our bladder is really not meant to be under our voluntary control. It's wired to the brain, and it's meant to only empty when it's gotten a signal that it's at least 3/4 full. So when you're doing this, what we call defensive voiding or peeing just in case, you're really messing with the neuroscience between your brain and your bladder. And what ends up happening is your bladder gets so confused that it kind of switches on and it stays on. And we call this overactive bladder. And then if an individual kind of more consistently will have this feeling like they have to pee all the time, but they'll go to try to pee and they might only pee for 2 or 3 seconds, because really the bladder's not full. It's just the bladder's switched on. And so they always feel like they have to pee. And this will eventually, if left untreated, will turn into urge incontinence, which is a nasty problem that no one wants. So one of the things we do when we catch that someone's having a bit of this overactive bladder is explaining to them this neuroscience so they understand to stop peeing just in case. They understand that they should only be peeing every few hours when their bladder's actually full. However, to get around these hiccups where they feel that annoying urge to pee and they want to get rid of that feeling, a really great way to do that is just by standing up at a wall and raising up your heel 5 times really quick, like a heel raise. And that rapid contraction of the calf muscle actually sends a message back to the bladder, so it relaxes and then it gets rid of that urge feeling. You have that urge feeling when the bladder is actually about to contract. So we want to have the bladder relaxed, and then you won't have that feeling.
And how often should an adult woman be using the restroom every day?
So that's another great point. So generally we say between 5 and 8 times in a 24-hour period. If you're premenopausal, none of those should be at night. So the 8 times in a 24-hour period, that's for that super crazy hydrated person, right? The 5 times is for the person who's kind of drinking enough water, but probably the bare minimum, right? And then other people are going to be in between. So there certainly is a range there, right? This isn't a one size fits all, but we know consistently that people who need to empty their bladder, regardless of how much water they drink, if it's more than 8 times in a 24-hour period, it's likely too much, or you're overhydrating. And your pee should look like pee and smell like pee. It shouldn't look like water, right? For the people who are under that, they actually might be dehydrated. And then we have to get into that. Your pee should look like pee and smell like pee. It shouldn't be like fluorescent orange, right? So that's something important to keep in mind. The other piece too is to empty a full bladder for the average size of a woman, it usually will take a minimum of 8 seconds. So that's another way you can gauge by how often in a 24-hour period. If you're that person that your sleep is interrupted every night because you're getting up to pee, that's a sign probably that you have some overactive bladder. Or if when you pee, you can never make it a full 8 seconds, like you feel like the longest you can pee is like 5 seconds, and sometimes it's even less than that, that's kind of a clear indication that you might benefit from a little bit of assistance from a pelvic physio.
That was something that really shocked me when I first learned that, you know, I was only going to go to the bathroom 5 to 8 times a day. I was like, that'll save me so much time. And I couldn't really believe it. But really, after even just a couple weeks, even maybe 1 to 2 months, that was a game changer for me to have that resolved, or like 99% resolved, which is really great. Could you give us a little bit more information about when a woman in her pregnancy should see you? Should she see you before she goes into labor and delivery? Should she come after? Maybe someone going through perimenopause, should they be coming in for a preventative appointment?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I am all about prevention. So I think it's ideal if someone can come in their 3rd trimester, so I can be talking to them about maybe some movements that now that they're later on in their pregnancy might be more likely to cause unnecessary strain, either through the abdominal wall or through their pelvic floor and back, right? As the baby's getting bigger and you're a little bit more limited in sort of the way you're able to move, that's often when these non-optimal strategies are going to be used, right? And sometimes it's not intuitive to someone a way to move that's going to be optimal to your body, right? So that's one piece of prevention. The other piece is I talk to women a lot about actual labor and delivery and how through that process you can minimize a lot of damage to the abdominal wall and pelvic floor. So I think that's a huge value add also. And then generally, people who have not been doing these inappropriate movements for their whole 3rd trimester, they end up birthing their baby with way less trauma because of everything we've gone over. They restore a lot quicker. And then usually I'll want to see them again kind of 4 to 6 weeks after they deliver. And for many people, then I don't need to see them again. I'll only want to see someone again if it seems like there might be something there that would be worthwhile for me to follow up on again. And that's something I'll follow up with usually at what I call the transition of the 4th trimester. So about 13 weeks after you've delivered, that's another big transition period. And that can sometimes be a nice time to check in with someone again. That having been said, I think prevention along the way is really the best medicine, right? So, I mean, if someone was entering into perimenopause or menopause and just experiencing some just minor physical changes, like even if it's just a little bit of vaginal dryness or a little bit more pain with intercourse because some of that tissue is starting to thin out, any subtle symptom, I would say absolutely. Like there's probably a lot, even if it means just education, that we could give you at the pelvic physio visit to help. And certainly a really good working pelvic floor to send nutrients to all the tissues of the pelvis. I mean, you're going to really want that working in your favor as you're going through those transition times in your life. So any of those times, I think that any of those transition times, I think are good times. Even painful periods, you know, that is something that there is so much, myself and my whole team at the womb, of course, including our naturopathic doctor, there's so much we can do for people with that. And I think people just have no idea. And they just think, oh, I just have to pop a few Midol and miss school. And I mean, that's crazy. You know, there's so much we can do. And we know that the females who have this problem, they're the ones often who are set up for persistent pain down the road and autoimmune conditions down the road. So if we can nip that in the bud in the teen years, we can be doing so much good for these people. So that's another kind of time that I think pelvic physio that's collaborative with other disciplines like naturopathic medicine is really underused.
And I've even seen women who felt that they were having ovarian pain or pain associated with PCOS, and it turned out to be like an MSK issue that could have been addressed if they would have seen a pelvic health physio, because we assume it's cramps. We assume it's just something that's normal, and it's not normal, and we can really do a lot to help these women. Could you talk a little bit more? You said you mentioned that you were doing some research at McMaster. Can you talk a little bit more about your research? It's really fascinating.
Yeah, so as far as research is concerned, we have really, really kind of clear, solid evidence that inform what we do around incontinence and prolapse. But where things get muddy and murky is in this area of diastasis rectus abdominis. And because that was a condition I had myself when I went through my own journey, I really made it my mission to kind of scour education and resources and a little bit of research from all over the world. So I kind of feel like as a physio, I have a good handle on this condition, but not a lot of pelvic physios actually do. So research that I'm doing with a colleague actually who is out of the University of Laval in Quebec. She's the co-lead on this with me. We have assembled expert physios from across Canada. So these are actually people who have the credentials of a clinical expert in women's health, or they have a PhD and they do research and teaching. So these are experts in the field. And we are in the process of doing a consensus study to basically get consensus from the experts in terms of getting some principles to consistently across the board how to handle this issue, because there's a lot of differing opinions. So that is something that I'm really, really excited about. We've already finished phase 1 of the consensus, so there's 2 more phases. So certainly stay tuned for that. Generally, it's sort of the approach that I've been following that kind of, I think in the end, that's what the consensus will be, but I'm not a participant in the consensus. I'm just the lead researching it. So that's exciting. There's also research I'm doing looking at a device that attaches to your iPhone that trains the pelvic floor. So myself and a professor from obstetrics and gynecology here at MAC are investigating this, and we want to see if standard care is equal to, and standard care meaning a proper pelvic floor exam, teaching someone how to properly contract and relax these muscles, so like proper standard care, if that's the same as standard care plus one of these devices that you would internally insert to train your pelvic floor, or if using a device like that actually holds any additional benefit. So that's a study that actually I'm recruiting for people right now. It only involves coming up to the womb twice. That's separated by a 4-month period. And individuals who have never had pelvic physio, this is a chance to maybe get sort of free pelvic physio. You can't be in the study if you have had pelvic physio, but you basically, at the time of your initial appointment, you need to be within the first 13 weeks after having a baby. So I've passed on some info about that study to Brianne that she can circulate, but that's one other study we're doing now.
And the womb, that's in Milton, correct? Milton, Ontario?
Exactly. That's right. So that is at our womb location in Milton. And yeah, it will be just on site. Each visit is not even quite a half an hour. And the requirement is only to come twice. So it really isn't a big time commitment. But yeah, we'll only be taking kind of the first 60 people. And I think we already have 10 people through. So we have about 50 more spots. Yeah.
Oh. And we'll post a link for that in the comments as well of the video, so that if you're interested, you can for sure take advantage of that really great opportunity.
Great.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Have we covered everything today?
I think that's probably it. But I guess the other point I just wanted to make was around belly binding. Wow. So that's another sort of question women sometimes have after delivery, you know, especially if they're worried about diastasis, because maybe it's their second pregnancy. They know they had a bit of this problem before, and they're seeing that they should be binding up their belly for this problem. And it's really interesting that in the consensus research project I'm working on right now, that's one of the issues that in the first round we didn't reach consensus on. So there are some people very strong and some people against doing this. So that's an issue that we need further discussion from all of our experts. And there's very compelling arguments actually on either side, right? So I think it's important to just have a few principles in mind when it does come to this binding. So one, I think it is reasonable if there are existing risk factors to using a tool like this, right? There isn't great solid evidence for using knee braces either. And that still is a practice that's used a lot and accepted, right? So as a rehabilitation principle, if there's compromise in an area and you just want to support it and you're supporting it properly, then I think that can be justified, right? So how the abdominal binders need to be used properly is there are some binders that are marketed that are cinching tools, right? To actually just get your middle tiny again. And those would be what you would want to avoid, because those will actually push pressure downward on a pelvic floor that probably isn't that strong after delivery and put you more at risk for prolapse, right? But if it was a style of binder that was flexible, that allowed you to wrap under the uterus and lift the uterus up a little bit, and then has a second sort of band that then crosses over, so you're getting some gentle lift, gentle approximation, and sort of the support around your pelvis, I think in many cases that can be justified, and I certainly have suggested that in cases. So I did just want to make a point about the belly binding.
And that's the individualized approach is something that I know you believe in and I believe in, and it's so important to just ask those questions and make that contact before jumping to something that you've seen on TV, right?
Exactly. And I guess that goes to show, like, that's another time why it's sometimes useful to kind of be linked up with someone who knows a bit about this stuff, so you can get some guidance. So you're not going off of what was shown in a commercial, and you're actually kind of digging a little bit deeper just to make sure that, one, is this product right for you? And two, if it is right for you, how can you use it in a way that's going to be the most effective for you? So yeah, so that was just another point about that.
And then even I would love to see every woman before starting an exercise program post-birth to at least have an assessment to see if that integrity is there, because that's something that I personally did. I was like, okay, let's get back into it. And it was so much harder to stop the exercise after I had already been exercising for a year and really go back to rebuilding that foundation. I should have just done it at the beginning, and I would have avoided probably a lot of the problems that I had I have really just went and saw an expert, repaired the foundation, and set myself up for success. But
yeah, for sure. And honestly, Brianne, I did the exact same thing. So I did the exact same thing. If I could only go back, and that's the exact message that, I think needs to be put out. You just have to restore your foundation, right? You need to have that foundational piece before you resume regular fitness. And that's going to look a little bit different for everyone. Some people can get there quicker than other people, right? But if you can just take things in that stepwise, manifestation that's necessarily, like, you need to crawl before you walk, you need to walk before you run. And if you skip steps, then oftentimes problems will happen, right? So yeah, that's exactly it. I think if this was a little bit more integrated into our system the way it is in France, I think we'd have a lot more healthier, happier women who could engage in their lives the way they want to.
And I hope that we're making way towards that, right? It's something to strive for. And the more awareness, the more interviews, the more we get that message out, just we'll be closer to that goal. So I want to thank you so much for joining. I know this has been extremely valuable to my audience, and I'm really hoping that we will get those 60 spots filled up really quick for you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for having me, Brianne. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and spread the word. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.